In the months leading up to June 1944, the Atlantic was not seen as a front with movement, but as a motionless wall. From the German command posts in Normandy, the war was heard before it was seen. The constant hum was the Allied aviation, the dry thud of bombs miles away, the buzzing of engines that imposed a strange schedule, the daylight, the tidal windows, and the night as the only space for maneuver. In those enclosed spaces, the officers' work was neither epic nor theatrical. It was repetitive, technical, and at times suffocating. Maps spread over tables, field telephones with vulnerable lines, coded messages, coastal surveillance reports, reconnaissance reports, and warnings that arrived without confirmation. The Atlantic Wall, in practice, was not a single continuous wall. It was a network of scattered strong points, overlapping sectors of responsibility, coastal batteries with different calibers and maintenance conditions, machine gun nests and anti-tank guns aimed at a coastline so long that no scheme could cover it completely. The German officers assigned to the defense of France lived in an uncomfortable balance between doctrine and reality. The doctrine demanded order, defined firing zones, registered minefields, obstacles in the intertidal zone, artillery with firing tables, reserves ready to counterattack. Reality imposed shortages, heterogeneous units, personnel of varying quality and origin, lack of fuel, limited ammunition, insufficient transport, vehicles that couldn't move forces quickly, and an enemy that controlled the air and could disrupt any daytime plan. At the command level, there was a question that was never theoretical. Where should the invasion be confronted? There was a cold logic in clinging to the coast. If the enemy managed to establish a beachhead, the material weight of the Allies would eventually crush a defense that could no longer be reinforced at the required pace. But there was also another equally harsh logic in not immobilizing all forces along the coastline. A defense that was too rigid could be broken by the initial blow, and if counterattacks were launched without coordination, they would be destroyed by the aviation before reaching the decisive point. In the bunkers, these disputes turned into procedures. The operations officer reviewed lists of available units, battery locations, and the condition of the roads. The intelligence officer gathered signals, prisoner interrogations, resistance rumors, military police reports, information on enemy concentrations in England. The communications officer fought against an invisible enemy, interference, cuts, failures in cables, lack of spare parts. Modern warfare for them was largely the struggle to maintain a conversation at a distance under bombardment. Meanwhile, the coastline was transformed into a permanent military workshop. In the strip of sand and pebbles, stakes and obstacles appeared, metal hedgehogs, elements designed to break the momentum of a landing. Firing positions were reinforced, angles were reviewed, new communication trenches were dug, bunkers were repaired with poor quality cement or just in time. The officers inspected the work with a practical eye. If the obstacle wasn't well fixed, the sea would move it. If the firing field was partially covered by a dune, the machine gun would be useless. If the observation from the post was limited, the artillery would fire blindly. However, no preparation was free from the human factor. There were garrisons that had been without direct combat for months, trapped in a routine of guards, drills, and repairs. Morale was uneven. Some clung to the idea that the enemy would not take risks. Others, on the contrary, took for granted that the blow was imminent and the only uncertainty was the day. In the command posts, that tension was noticeable in the smallest details. The tone when dictating a report, the way of asking for confirmation, the insistence on having a patrol return with information, even if it was night and under the threat of an ambush. The central problem was information. There were plenty of signs that the attack was approaching, an increase in flights, systematic bombings of railway hubs, bridges and roads, sabotage of lines, growing clandestine activity. But these clues didn't say exactly where the front would open. The French coast offered options, direct routes to ports, beaches suitable for vehicles, areas near urban centres, zones where the defence might be weaker due to lack of troops or equipment. This uncertainty fueled another phenomenon, alert fatigue. Each false alarm eroded the credibility of the next one. Every night, with reports of movement at sea that turned out to be nothing, made it harder to mobilize everyone quickly when the invasion was real. The officers knew this, and still their duty was to treat each signal as potentially decisive. In January and February, alerts could be sustained. By March and April, fatigue began to filter in. By May, the waiting was no longer just military, it was physical, psychological, a tension that had set in. In the days leading up to June, the Channel's weather became another factor in the bunkers. The sea and sky were capricious allies of the defense. Storms and poor visibility could delay the enemy's operation, force them to postpone or disrupt coordination. But they could also harm the defenders, hinder observation, complicate movements, make bombings and landings in unexpected sectors unpredictable. The weather wasn't a detail, it was an operational variable. By this point, life inside the concrete bunkers was defined by a strict routine. Part of the morning, sector reviews, ammunition control, position status checks. Noon, brief meetings, order adjustments, reports to the higher command. Afternoon, inspections, alert drills, communication line repairs. Night, patrols, surveillance, cables laid in the dark, guard rotations, and always the same background noise, the sound of planes that couldn't be stopped, the feeling that the enemy controlled the rhythm of the war. For many officers, the defense was no longer a matter of fortifications, but of time. The essential goal was to hold the positions long enough for reserves to strike in the right place. This meant two difficult conditions: knowing where the right place was and getting the reserves to move in time. In every exercise, in every simulation, the same concern would arise. If communications were cut, if the roads were destroyed, if the higher command hesitated, the defensive mechanism would become slow, and slowness was a sure path to defeat. By the end of May, in the German command posts, the maps showed a front without open combat, but no one interpreted it as a sign of tranquility. It was a charged calm. The orders became more precise, the inspections more frequent, the warnings sharper. Alert schedules were adjusted, codes were verified, procedures were reviewed in case of paratroopers, in case of massive bombing, in case of a dawn landing. Night of the 5th to the 6th, signals, confusion, and first alarms. The first Battle of D-Day, seen from the German bunkers, did not begin on the shore. It began in the nervous system of the defense. Telephones, radios, links, codes, command chains. At the command posts, the night of June 5th to 6th resembled many others, at least during the first few minutes. The channel was dark, the wind was shifting, and the surveillance repeated learned routines. But from 11 p.m. onward, the flow of messages started to follow a different pattern. Too many points at once, too many small interruptions that, when added together, ceased to be just noise. The first report spoke of aerial activity. It was the kind of message that could mean anything. In the previous months, the Luftwaffe had been unable to contest the skies in any sustained way, and the presence of Allied planes was constant. But that night, several sectors reported something more specific: the sound of engines in waves, aircraft flying low, signs of interference, and flashes on the horizon. In one coastal command post, an officer asked for confirmation from a neighboring post. In another, someone tried to triangulate the origin based on sentry reports that could only make out shadows. The chain of command was tested by an old mental trap: the fear of deception. The Germans had been expecting an invasion for so long that the danger was no longer just not seeing it coming, but reacting incorrectly when it arrived. The defenses had lived through alerts that ended up meaning nothing, reports inflated by nervousness, and signals intentionally provoked by the enemy to measure response times. This experience created operational caution. No one wanted to move decisive resources based on a false alarm, and no one wanted to confirm an invasion without evidence that could withstand scrutiny. However, this caution had an immediate cost. Every minute spent confirming was a minute without clear orders, and time in coastal defense was a resource more scarce than ammunition. In the bunkers, the dilemma was resolved with procedures: register, verify, escalate. But procedures assume the system works, and that night the system began to fragment. In parallel to the aerial activity, reports came in of interruptions in ground communications. A cut cable could be an accident. 2 cables cut in nearby areas, a technical problem. 3 cuts in different areas over a short span of time began to suggest enemy action. In some sectors, forward posts stopped responding. In others, patrols sent to check did not return or came back with confusing reports: distant gunfire, silhouettes on secondary roads, isolated explosions. The duty officers tried to keep the situation orderly, but the events were piling up with a disturbing characteristic. They were scattered, as if the enemy was not striking a single point but a network. Around midnight, the reports changed tone. Mentions of men appeared in the rear. At first, the word could refer to saboteurs, resistance groups, or infiltrated commandos. It wasn't an absurd hypothesis. The previous months had shown an increase in sabotage and clandestine activity. But the way the contacts were described didn't match small-scale actions. They spoke of larger groups, of multiple locations at once, of confusion between security units and garrison troops that didn't know exactly what they were facing. In an interior command post, an officer received a report of a blocked intersection. He noted it, asked for the exact location, and ordered a motorized link to be sent. Minutes later, another report mentioned gunfire near a different bridge. The procedure was repeated. After the third report, the officer stopped assuming coincidences. On the table, the map began to fill with marks. Red dots, arrows, question marks. They weren't front lines. They were holes in a rear area that in theory should have been controlled. Meanwhile, at the coastal posts, the primary concern remained the sea. The observers looked toward the channel for a definitive signal, shadows of ships, reflections of a fleet, the massive hum of engines. But visibility was low, and the enemy seemed to have chosen the night to deny information. What could be heard was something else: explosions on the ground, getting closer in some sectors, and the passing of aircraft. From a bunker, an officer could have the feeling that the outside world was filling with activity without any pieces quite fitting together. The German reaction depended on a rigid architecture, levels and authorizations. The coastal units could respond with their immediate resources, but the movement of larger reserves and, above all, armored forces got tangled in decisions from higher command. That night, the duty officers in intermediate posts did what they could: elevate reports, request instructions, reinforce sensitive points with what was available. The problem was that what was available in a night garrison didn't always mean maneuverable forces. It meant tired men, scarce transportation, and insecure routes. As dawn approached, the messages began to include details that left no room for comfortable interpretations. Several witnesses spoke of paratroopers. Some reports said it directly, others described it without naming it: white fabrics, hanging shadows, men descending. The information was irregular. In several cases, the parachutes fell scattered, which could suggest a disorganized operation due to weather or anti-aircraft fire, but the scattering could also be a deliberate effect to confuse. For the German officers, this difference was crucial and, by this hour, impossible to determine. At one command post, someone asked what many were thinking. If there were paratroopers, was this the start of the invasion or a distraction? In theory, an airborne operation could serve to isolate the beaches, take crossings and bridges, block reinforcements. It could also be a feint to force reserves to move inland, away from the coastline. The enemy had shown a capacity for deception and had built a strategic fog over the months. The German officers knew this, and this awareness, far from clarifying, clouded the situation. Every decision seemed to offer the risk of falling into a trap. The orders issued in those first hours had a cautious and defensive character. They instructed securing crossings, patrolling around key objectives, protecting communication posts, reinforcing guards at depots and command centers. Security and garrison units were ordered to form search groups and avoid uncoordinated movements. In some sectors, harassment fires were authorized in areas where paratroopers were believed to have landed. It was a way to react without committing large forces, but it was also a way to fire blindly, risking wasting ammunition and revealing positions. Shortly after 1 o'clock, several posts reported brief and confused combats. Bursts of fire, shouts, short explosions, silences. It was the kind of contact that caused more disorder than destruction, and that was precisely its function. The goal wasn't to gain ground at that stage, but to break control, force mistakes, cut links. In the bunkers, the officers tried to piece together the situation with successive calls. But the map, instead of stabilizing, fragmented more. Between 1:30 and 2 o'clock, the word invasion began to appear, though still with caution. An officer might think it without writing it. Another might write it without saying it. At higher levels, the tendency was to avoid absolute statements until confirmation of landings. At lower levels, where the shots were heard nearby, reality didn't call for confirmation. It demanded decisions. This vertical tension became visible in the tone of the messages. Some requested authorization to move units. Others responded with requests for more data. Others didn't respond. By 2 o'clock, several interior sectors were no longer talking about isolated sabotage. They were talking about enemy forces on the ground. The telephone lines were failing more frequently. The links took longer. Orders arrived late or didn't arrive at all. The duty officers began to act with minimal logic. Secure what could be secured, hold the post, maintain communication with whoever still responded. The airborne strike and the chaos in the rear. From 2 o'clock onward, the night stopped being a collection of disconnected reports and turned into an expanding tactical problem. For the German officers, the most dangerous aspect of the airborne strike was not its immediate power, but its effect on the command structure. The coastal defense was designed as a system: observation posts that alerted, batteries that received data, communication centers that transmitted orders, reserves moving along planned routes. The enemy operation, on the other hand, attacked the network as a network. It didn't seek to conquer large areas in those hours, but to disrupt the flow of information and turn every crossroads into a threat. At the interior command posts, the first symptom was the degradation of certainty. The same question was repeated in different forms. How many are there? Where are they? What do they want? The patrol reports spoke of brief contacts, gunfire from bushes, silhouettes moving in small groups, explosions at sensitive points. The duty officer marked positions on the map with a pencil, and in doing so created an imaginary front that changed every 10 minutes. In this phase, the maps didn't serve to draw lines, but to measure the extent of confusion. The Germans had units assigned to security and territorial control: garrison troops, surveillance detachments, military police forces, and elements that could improvise quick reactions. But the quality and preparation varied greatly. Some units were made up of experienced soldiers, others included personnel with less training, limited equipment, or reduced mobility. Additionally, the nighttime reaction was conditioned by the simplest terror: moving without seeing. The enemy had landed in a landscape of hedgerows, narrow roads, isolated farms, and partitioned fields. An officer might order search and eliminate without realizing that the geography turned that command into a series of potential ambushes. The airborne strike also altered the practical hierarchy. In theory, higher command was supposed to coordinate. In practice, during those hours, initiative fell into the hands of local officers who made decisions with minimal information. Makeshift combat groups were formed with whatever was available: an infantry section, a machine gun, a light vehicle, a pair of motorcycles. The logic was simple: recover crossings, secure bridges, clear roads. But that logic clashed with one fact: the enemy was precisely where it was most effective to paralyze movement, not where it was easiest to destroy them. The reports about paratroopers initially showed dispersion. From the German perspective, this could be interpreted as an imperfect drop due to weather or anti-aircraft fire. However, as the night progressed, irregularity appeared. In different places, the same consequences were repeated. Roads cut off, bridges threatened, patrols stopped, units unable to regroup. The dispersion didn't negate effectiveness; on the contrary, it multiplied it. Every small enemy group was enough to force the Germans to deploy more men than they could concentrate and to waste time confirming threats. In some sectors, German officers attempted immediate counterattacks. These were quick, localized actions meant to regain control before dawn. But these counterattacks faced two structural problems. The first was the identification of the enemy. In the darkness, with uniforms that were not always distinguishable at a distance, and with the possibility of infiltration, nerves could turn any shadow into a threat. The second was coordination. Without stable communications, each group acted based on its own perception of danger. One officer might believe they were facing a small enemy patrol when, in reality, they were entering the perimeter of a position held by more numerous airborne forces. Another might concentrate men at a secondary crossing while the main crossing, just a few kilometers away, was left exposed. The result was a type of combat without large masses, but with high disruptive performance. Short bursts of fire, close contact engagements, pursuits that led to nothing, explosions on specific points. For an officer in a bunker, the map became a board of incidents, not a coherent battlefield. The control of territory in those hours was measured by the ability to keep routes open, not by the possession of villages. In the rear, the German objectives were clear: protect command centers, depots, communication links, and above all, routes of movement. The idea was simple. When the landing occurred, the reserves should move toward the coast. But that same idea, when it filtered into the minds of the officers, revealed the vulnerability. If the enemy had ceded the rear, it was to delay that march. The coastal defense could not depend on reinforcements that might never arrive. As dawn approached, another phenomenon added to the confusion: rumors. In situations of uncertainty, rumors travel faster than orders. Some spoke of thousands of paratroopers, others of small commando units. Some said the main attack would be further north, others said Normandy was the decisive maneuver. The officers tried to separate the rumors from the facts, but even the facts were distorted by distance. A witness might see a parachute and assume the area was full of them. A patrol might hear gunfire and assume there was a battalion. That night, the enemy didn't need to be everywhere. It was enough for them to be credible everywhere. At the coastal posts, the pressure was also growing. Officers looking out to sea began to receive reports from the interior that altered their priorities. Paratroopers near this crossing, bridge compromised, link lost. This created a double front problem. The coast awaited the main blow from the channel, but the rear was already in combat. For a rigid defense, this bifurcation was dangerous. Every man sent inland was one less man on the coast. Every unit held on the coast was one less to clear the routes. At higher levels, interpreting the airborne operation was the core of the discussion. The officers tried to decide whether this was the direct prelude to the landing or a maneuver aimed at drawing reserves. Recent history had shown that the enemy could build large-scale deceptions and could rely on air superiority to punish any hasty moves. This strategic memory acted as a brake. Instead of an automatic push toward the point of combat, the need for confirmation emerged, but confirmation was an expensive commodity. It came late, or it arrived filtered through contradictory messages. In a bunker, an officer might receive a report saying contact with paratroopers, and 10 minutes later another saying nothing found. A third might report explosion on bridge, without clarifying whether the bridge was destroyed or just damaged. With such poor quality information, decisions tended to be conservative: secure the immediate, wait for more data, hold reserves. When the sky began to clear, the situation didn't resolve, it changed shape. With more light, observation improved, but the German vulnerability also became more visible. The roads showed craters, fallen cables, improvised barriers, stopped vehicles. The officers could finally see the physical dimension of the disorder that had previously been only a chain of messages. By around 500, the airborne element had achieved the essential, not a decisive victory, but a partial collapse of German control in key rear areas. The enemy had created a condition of delay and doubt. For the Germans, the immediate challenge was to recover continuity, reopen roads, restore links, consolidate dispersed units, and prevent small enemy groups from dictating the agenda. But by that hour, the coastal clock was moving toward another event. The sea, which during the night had been an unknown, was beginning to become a scenario. The officers in coastal bunkers, who had spent hours staring at a shapeless horizon, were preparing for the moment when the enemy would no longer be a shadow between the dunes, but a visible mass of boats. Dawn, the coast lights up, and the sea speaks. At 5:30, the horizon began to separate into layers. First, a grey line over the channel, then a lighter strip heralding the dawn. At the German observation posts, sentries and surveillance officers were not yet looking for details. They were looking for confirmation, a disturbance in the sea that could not be attributed to the weather, a presence that was not imaginary. For months, they had lived with the fear of making mistakes in two opposite directions, underestimating a real signal or overreacting to a false one. That dawn, the sea eliminated the ambiguity. The first confirmation did not come as a sharp image, but as a sum of technical clues. Observers began to report anomalous reflections, dark profiles, lines that didn't correspond to isolated ships. The channel, seen from land, could deceive: shadows of clouds, banks of fog, waves of light. But when the reports matched at several points, the picture changed. A coastal officer might not yet distinguish the types of vessels, but he could understand something essential. This was not normal traffic, nor a patrol. It was volume. In the bunkers, the reaction followed the path of procedure: brief messages, approximate coordinates, requests for cross-verification. The command posts tried to maintain a coherent chain of information to the artillery batteries and higher echelons. The problem was that the system had already been weakened by the night: cut cables, delayed links, interference. Many sectors depended on field radios with limited range and operators working under stress. Still, by that hour, the attempt to maintain control was almost automatic. Without control, the coastal defense became a series of isolated islands. As the light grew, the second phenomenon appeared: the sky. For the Germans, the Allied Air Force was not a surprise element, but a structural fact. But in the hours leading up to the landing, the weight of the air became denser. It was no longer just about planes passing by, it was about a pattern: waves, directions, altitudes, repeated sounds. The officer in a coastal bunker could feel that the war was settling into a machine: first the air, then the sea, then the coast. Soon after, the bombing began. In some sectors, it manifested as distant, dry thuds, in others as nearby impacts that shook the concrete and raised dust inside the command rooms. The German defenses were built to withstand, and many positions could endure impacts without collapsing. But withstanding was not the same as maintaining effectiveness. The shock wave could break equipment, misalign optics, cut internal cables, jam doors, and fill corridors with smoke. The coastal artillery, even when intact, could lose its ability to fire accurately if the observation post was blinded or the link with the command post was interrupted. The bombing also had a less visible but more decisive effect. It destroyed the rhythm. Coastal defense relied on the coordination of fire, observation, and the quick transmission of orders. Under intense bombing, every action became slower. The message that had previously taken seconds could now take minutes. The officer who had once compared reports now had to do so with dust in the air and constant noise. The war inside a bunker was not an open combat scene but an exercise in continuity, keeping the operations table running while the outside world fell apart. At the gun positions, the crews prepared for direct contact. The German defensive logic on the coast was clear: deny the beach with crossfire and turn the intertidal zone into a death corridor. The casemates were oriented to cover specific sectors, not to fire in any direction. This gave them power in one angle, but also made them dependent on the enemy showing up where expected. As the light of dawn spread, the officers tried to read the enemy deployment: which sectors the boats were heading to, where the smoke was concentrating, which points were being hit hardest. The first landing craft were not seen as landing craft from the very beginning. At first, they were moving spots, growing lines, objects appearing and disappearing between waves, but the quantity erased the doubt. And then the most important psychological change occurred. For the Germans in those bunkers, the enemy ceased to be a concept, a statistic, or a possibility, and became a concrete shape advancing. The invasion, which for months had been a heavy word in meetings, was now a physical phenomenon in the water. The morning on the beaches, decisions under pressure. From 7:30 onwards, combat ceased to be a phenomenon observed from the coast and became a command crisis within each strongpoint. For the German officers, the central problem was no longer identifying whether a landing had occurred, but rather measuring which parts of the defense were still functioning as a system. Under ideal conditions, the coastal sectors were supposed to absorb the initial blow, hold the enemy in the intertidal zone, and buy time for reserves to counterattack. In practice, that morning time was not accumulated. It was lost in small blows: a communication link down, an observation post destroyed, a cannon jammed, an isolated crew. The officers in bunkers and command posts near the beach faced a situation of incomplete information. From their interiors, they saw only a segment of the world: a firing arc, a stretch of sand, an access between dunes, a road leading down to the coast. The rest came through messages. But the messages were becoming shorter, more fragmented, and often interrupted by combat. Thus, decision-making became local by necessity. Even when a higher command order existed, its interpretation depended on what the officer on duty could verify with their own eyes. In some sectors, German defensive fire remained coherent. The positions aimed to fire in enfilade over the beach, where machine guns and anti-tank guns could sweep the sand, produced an immediate effect. Delays, enemy concentration stopped, boats hit as they approached. But that effectiveness had a physical limit. If the enemy managed to find a point of cover, a terrain fold, an access protected by smoke, or the chaos of the landing, the German fire scheme began to lose its geometry. The crossfire, which on paper seemed perfect, depended on the pieces communicating with each other through links and observation. When a position fell silent, the void became a corridor. For many German officers, the morning was organized around 3 simultaneous tasks. The first was to hold the position, keep weapons functioning, prevent the bunker from being surrounded, preserve ammunition. The second was to communicate, send reports upwards and receive orders. The third was to improvise, move men between points, close gaps, create reaction groups for local counterattacks. These 3 tasks competed with each other. An officer who left to reorganize defenses could lose control of the communication center. One who focused on the telephone might ignore an infiltration through a secondary access. One who insisted on holding the strongpoint until the last man could become a useless island if the enemy had already penetrated behind. At the regimental and divisional command posts, combat became an incomplete board. There were reports from multiple beaches, each with its own intensity and rhythm. There were reports of penetrations in some sectors and solid resistance in others. There were repeated requests for reinforcements, artillery, ammunition, medical assistance, and communication links. And at the same time, the rear was still disrupted by airborne actions. The German defense was being pushed in 2 directions, toward the coast to contain the landing and toward the interior to recover routes and prevent small enemy groups from dictating the movement of reserves. The key decisions began to revolve around a simple problem: where to put the little that could move. In some areas, officers attempted to organize local counterattacks with nearby units. This idea was consistent with tactical doctrine: strike quickly before the enemy consolidated. But the execution faced concrete obstacles. Many units were incomplete, some were scattered due to nighttime alerts, others lacked transport. The roads were under enemy observation or directly under attack. And time once again was the enemy. A counterattack arriving an hour late was not late. It was a different operation because the adversary had already landed more men, already brought in weapons, and already organized its own supporting fire. As the morning progressed, the difference between containing and expelling became evident. Containing meant preventing the enemy from advancing beyond the beach. Expelling meant pushing them back to the sea. To expel, mass and coordination were needed. To contain, it was enough to hold critical points, deny access, and destroy concentrations. The German officers first clung to containment. It was the only plausible option with scattered forces and the sky in enemy hands. But that choice had a strategic consequence. Each minute the enemy stayed on land increased the probability that the beachhead would become permanent. The combat within the strongpoints took on a repeated dynamic. The enemy advanced in small units, probing for flanks, entrances, and blind spots. The defenders responded with fire from protected positions, but they had to conserve ammunition and avoid being pinned down. Where bombardment had damaged communications, a strongpoint could continue firing without knowing that the neighboring position had fallen. Where a bunker became isolated, the enemy might decide to encircle it rather than assault it, leaving a garrison intact but irrelevant. For the German officers, this possibility was despairing: to resist and yet have no impact on the outcome. In several sectors, German artillery attempted to sustain the defense by firing on the beach and access points, but artillery depended on observation and communication lines. If the observer was silenced, fire became less accurate. If the wire was cut, the battery became separated from command. Some pieces continued firing on their own initiative. Others had to cease due to lack of orders, lack of identifiable targets, or risk of friendly fire. The confusion on the coast made it harder to identify where their own troops were and where the enemy was gathering. The artillery officer, without a clear picture, found themselves making decisions that could be right or disastrous with the same level of certainty. Between 9 o'clock and 10:30, command posts began to register a qualitative change. The enemy was no longer just waves of infantry under fire. Signs of heavier equipment consolidating, support positions being established, and units going from chaotic beach forces to organized land elements began to appear. This step was critical because it meant the landing was not crumbling on its own. 'own. 'Every indication of consolidation forced the German officers to recalculate. What was not destroyed in the coastal zone would have to be confronted later under worse conditions. The pressure on decision-making increased. Officers on the front line requested immediate reinforcements, sometimes without specifying where they could come from. Higher command demanded reports, sometimes unable to respond with resources. A typical friction of a crisis occurred. The desire to act clashed with the command structure and logistical reality. And in the midst of that friction, local officers continued making practical decisions, moving a machine gun to a better angle, destroying an access point with explosives, reorganizing a section without its officer, evacuating wounded without sufficient means. Midday, the controller's clock and the battle for the reserves. The midday of June 6th was not, for the German officers, a linear continuation of the morning's combat. It was a change in scale. Until 11:30, the invasion could be described as a sum of local crises, one stronghold that held, another isolated, a sector where fire still crossed the beach, another where communications had broken down. From that point on, the problem became strategic operational, deciding whether there was still an opportunity to crush the landing with mobile reserves, or if the defense should fall back to a more realistic objective, contain and delay. The word reserve carried an almost abstract weight. On maps and plans, reserves were arrows. In reality, they were units sleeping at a distance, vehicles needing fuel, columns requiring routes, orders that had to pass through a damaged chain of command. Furthermore, the decisive reserve was not just any force, it was the force capable of striking quickly and with sufficient mass. On the Western Front, this largely meant armored units, and around the armored units revolved the most delicate political military knot of the entire defense, who had real authority to move them, when and where. At higher command posts, midday resembled a pressure cooker calculation room. Officers received reports from different sectors, with varying degrees of urgency and precision. The question was not just where the fighting was fiercest, but where a counterattack could change the outcome. A poorly executed counterattack was doubly useless. Not only was the unit lost, but time was also lost. And time was the only theoretical advantage left for the defenders, the interval between the first landing and the enemy's logistical consolidation. The main difficulty was the incomplete picture of the battlefield. The invasion was not coming as a single arrow, but as several. The report spoke of active beaches, penetrations and resistance, paratroopers still disrupting routes, logistics nodes in danger, batteries still firing, others silenced. In this multiplicity, command had to choose a center that perhaps did not exist. The enemy had achieved a fundamental effect, forcing the Germans to think in terms of uncertainty. From below, the pressure was brutal. Coastal officers requested immediate reinforcements. They weren't asking for speeches or plans. They were asking for men and ammunition, asking for anti-tank guns, asking for vehicles. Many messages had the same tone. The situation is becoming critical. I need support. I'm losing control of the sector. But higher command had to filter that urgency with cold logic. Reinforcing a sector on the verge of collapse could be necessary to prevent a breakthrough, but it could also be a waste if the breakthrough was already irreversible, or if the reinforcements arrived too late. In a command bunker, that coldness translated into lists. Distances, marching times, possible routes, bombing risks, choke points. Meanwhile, the enemy was leaving its mark on midday, attacks on columns and roads. Every German movement by day was observed and punished. Units attempting to move along main routes were exposed to air attacks. That didn't mean any movement was impossible, but it did mean a high price was paid for moving openly. German officers knew this reality from experience. That's why many movement orders were issued with excessive caution, with alternative routes, with attempts at camouflage, with deliberate delays to wait for a window of reduced air activity. But that caution, again, ate up the time that was needed. Coordination between echelons was, in those hours, a problem in itself. Officers requesting a decisive counterattack imagined a compact mass hitting an enemy flank before it could solidify. Officers who had to organize it saw something else. Scattered units, roads cut off at isolated points, links that took time, incomplete communications, and a rear area still uneasy due to the airborne presence. It wasn't just that the enemy was on the beach, it was that the enemy was also at the crossroads. The battle for the reserves was also a battle of interpretation. Many German officers were still trapped by a question inherited from the months of waiting. What if this isn't the main attack? The possibility of a second landing in another sector, perhaps further north, was not an irrational ghost. The Allies had fueled this idea with deceptions and signals. For the German command, committing the best forces to Normandy meant accepting that the main threat was there and that there would be no decisive blow elsewhere the following day. That decision was both strategic and psychological. It meant betting the most valuable resources under enemy skies. Thus, midday became a constant negotiation between urgency and caution. At some command posts, orders were given to prepare movements without executing them until further notice. Efforts were made to concentrate units, assemble scattered battalions, and organize Kampfgruppen with available elements. Orders were issued for units to maintain counterattack capacity, avoiding becoming fixed in static defense. But the enemy on the ground was not waiting for the German plan to be completed. Every hour added more men and material to the beachhead. Every hour allowed the enemy to improve their organization on land, expand their perimeter, establish fire support, and connect key points. There was also an administrative wear and tear that, under combat conditions, became decisive. Duplicate orders, reports that reached 2 offices and none, messages that were repeated because it was unclear if they had been received, units moving on their own initiative, then unable to be located. In a command post, an officer might spend an entire hour trying to locate a unit that, in theory, was available for a counterattack. Without that unit, the plan changed. With that unit, the plan might still exist. Modern warfare, in that moment, seemed more like a problem of location than a problem of courage. On the coast, the fighting continued to drain energy. Some strongholds held out, isolated, with the feeling that the world around them was shifting. Others tried short retreats toward interior positions to avoid being surrounded. In those retreats, discipline was uneven. An orderly withdrawal could preserve combat capability. A disorganized withdrawal was dissolution. Officers still in control tried to avoid the latter, but they couldn't always do so. Bombing, smoke, the loss of links, the appearance of enemy forces from unexpected flanks, everything pushed towards fragmentation. By 1400, the central question in the German command posts was essentially one: is there still a window to cut off the invasion before it becomes irreversible? This question did not have a theoretical answer. It had an answer of minutes, kilometers, and ammunition. If the reserve arrived in time and struck at the right place, it could break the perimeter. If it arrived too late, it would collide with a stronger enemy with air and naval support and would be worn down without changing the outcome. By 1500, signs began to emerge that for a German officer were alarming not because of their drama, but because of their meaning. The enemy was connecting their points, expanding the perimeter, consolidating. This meant the landing was no longer just a series of beaches. It was a nascent front. Afternoon, counterattacks, retreats, and the breakdown of local control. Between 1530 and 1930, June 6th entered a phase that German officers knew well from experience, though they did not want to name it. The phase in which command stops directing the combat and begins to manage damage. Until that moment, it was still possible to imagine a blow that could reverse the situation. A counterattack with reserves, an effective concentration of fire, a breakthrough of the beachhead before the enemy could connect their points. By mid-afternoon, that margin began to narrow for concrete and repeated reasons: battered routes, dispersed units, degraded communications, and an adversary who was no longer just landing on the coast but starting to behave like an army on the ground. For the officers in coastal posts, the afternoon meant a simple reality. Many strongholds remained intact, but they were no longer part of a system. The defense had turned into an archipelago. Some bunkers continued firing on beach sectors, but they did so without coordination with their neighbors, unsure whether the flank was covered or exposed. Other positions were isolated by enemy penetrations through secondary access points, hedged paths, or gaps created by bombing. Under these conditions, resisting could be militarily correct and tactically useless at the same time. A bunker could hold out for hours, even all day, but if the enemy had passed behind and taken the exit nodes, the garrison became a fixed point without the capacity to influence the emerging front. At the regimental and divisional command posts, the picture was even harder due to its abstraction. Officers received reports that no longer described a line but cascading incidents: loss of contact with company, retreat to secondary position, enemy on the route, request for anti-tank support, observation impossible, ammunition low, forward post evacuated. The afternoon did not bring clarity. It brought confirmation that the uncertainty of the morning was solidifying into facts, sectors that could not be recovered with local means, routes that were no longer reliable, and units that, through wear or isolation, were losing their cohesion. The word counterattack remained present, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer about a broad strike meant to push the enemy back into the sea. It was about partial counterattacks, quick reactions, attempts to recover crossings or close a specific penetration. German officers improvised Kampfgruppen with available elements, hastily gathered garrison infantry, anti-tank sections, light artillery if it could be moved, and, when possible, some armored components. The goal was simple: prevent the enemy from extending their control inland. But every counterattack faced the same operational problem: getting to the point of contact without being destroyed on the way and without losing coordination upon arrival. The Allied air superiority continued to be, during these hours, a multiplier of friction. German officers could plan a movement, but its execution depended on open roads and some freedom of movement by day. The afternoon showed the opposite: roads with interrupted military traffic, bridges under threat, columns forced to stop or scatter, and orders to advance that turned into orders to survive the advance. Added to this was the Norman geography, which favored local defense and ambushes: high hedges, sunken roads, blind curves. For a force seeking speed, it was hostile terrain. For small enemy units already on the ground, it was ideal terrain for delay. At this stage, many German officers faced the classic dilemma of retreat. Holding an exposed position could mean being surrounded and losing it along with the entire unit. Retreating to an interior position could preserve men and weapons, but it also yielded ground and opened the path for the enemy. Retreat also required communications and discipline. An orderly retreat could turn into a new line. A retreat under bombardment with broken links tended to fragment, and that fragmentation was the main enemy of command. A fragmented unit not only fought worse, but also reported worse, regrouped worse, and consumed more resources to be located. The artillery officers, for their part, felt the afternoon as a deterioration of sight. The batteries that still had ammunition and crews could fire, but the value of the shots depended on the data. With observation posts destroyed, lines cut, and constant smoke and dust, adjusting fire became more difficult. Some batteries fired on predetermined areas, others did so at the request of units that managed to transmit coordinates. But even when the coordinates were correct, the risk of friendly fire increased as the front became more confused. For an officer, this was almost an unsolvable problem. Fire was necessary to halt the enemy, but the fog of war raised the cost of using it. In many command posts, the afternoon also became an exercise in human accounting. Reports of the wounded, losses of officers, units without direct command. The death of a company officer could be, in a static defense, a serious but manageable problem. In an infiltration and breakthrough fight, it was a fracture. The Germans depended on a relatively rigid chain of command. When it was cut at lower levels, local reactions became erratic. That's why in several sectors the command improvised, NCOs taking control, officers from other units gathering scattered groups. Communication personnel turned into infantry. These were emergency solutions, useful to hold for hours, but insufficient to restore a total defense. Meanwhile, the enemy did what the afternoon allowed: connect, expand, consolidate. The transition from the beach to the interior was not a blind rush, but a construction of perimeters. German officers noticed this in the details: more coordinated fire from the land, increasing presence of enemy support weapons, patrols that were no longer just exploratory but for control, pressure on key access points. It wasn't necessary to see the entire beachhead to understand the pattern. It was enough to note that each hour made it more difficult to penetrate toward the coast and easier for the enemy to defend what they had already gained. At higher echelons, the afternoon brought a type of message that in military terms equates to a diagnosis: requests for authorization for limited withdrawals, proposals for reorganizing in interior lines, requests to concentrate units that could no longer hold their original position. These messages were not defeatist, they were practical. An officer didn't request a withdrawal out of fear, but because the position had lost its tactical value or because holding it would mean losing the entire unit without benefit. But each withdrawal also implied admitting, even if only in technical terms, that the original plan of containment on the coast had failed in key sectors. By 1800, the breakdown of local control became visible in an administrative sign, the difficulty in knowing where one's own forces were. In several areas, command could no longer assert with precision which points were occupied and which were not. They could guess, receive partial reports, but they couldn't see it as a whole. And without that vision, coordinating a broad counterattack became unlikely. The command had to choose, attempt small blows, hold interior lines, and prepare the night as a space for reorganization. By 1900, combat in some coastal sectors was still active, but the afternoon had sealed a trend. The German defense had not collapsed everywhere, but it had lost the ability to operate as a single mechanism. The enemy, on the other hand, was already operating with enough continuity to transform landing points into a front in formation. Night of June 6th and 7th, countings, reorganization, and the strategic reality. The night of June 6th did not bring silence. In the German command posts, the fall of light only changed the type of problem. During the day, the pressure had been immediate, holding positions, responding to fire, attempting local counterattacks, surviving a communication system that was unraveling. At dusk, the challenge became both administrative and operational, reconstructing an image of the front, gathering dispersed units, recording losses, and deciding what could still be done with what was left. Inside the bunkers and command centers, the night was organized around tasks that seemed minor but were decisive, identifying which companies were still operational and where, determining which batteries had ammunition and firing capacity, checking which routes could be used without being exposed or blocked, restoring contact with posts that hadn't responded since the afternoon. Each of these tasks consumed time and at the same time created it. Without information, there was no order. Without order, there was no movement. Without movement, there was no possibility of recovering the initiative. In many sectors, the first conclusion wasn't tactical, but physical. The coastal defense was no longer continuous. There were still garrisons fighting in strongholds, but the enemy had achieved sufficient penetrations to move between them. For a German officer, that situation had a practical name: isolation. An isolated stronghold could resist, but it could not prevent the enemy from expanding their perimeter through lateral routes or access points that the original geometry of firing fields did not cover. The night allowed this reality to be confirmed with communications messages. Patrols attempting to reach friendly positions found enemy forces in between, routes cut off, roads under fire, villages where it was no longer possible to distinguish friendly control from enemy control. At the same time, the night offered a partial opportunity to move without the constant punishment of air attacks. Many German officers viewed this window as the last space where reorganization could be done with fewer losses. But night movement was not a free gesture. The Normandy terrain, with narrow roads and high hedges, turned every movement into a risk. The confusion of the day had left units mixed up, abandoned vehicles, improvised obstacles, and the threat of small enemy patrols capable of halting a column without the need to defeat it. At this stage, delaying was as valuable as destroying. At higher command posts, situation reports were drafted with restrained language. Officers tried to describe without dramatizing because the goal of these documents was to produce decisions, not impressions. But even technical language could not hide certain facts. The enemy had managed to sustain and expand beachheads. They had succeeded in connecting points in various sectors. They had introduced enough material for the German defense to no longer rely on the natural attrition of the landing. The invasion was not running out of steam, it was maturing. The night was also the moment for the human tally, lists of the wounded, dead and missing, units with fallen officers and command replaced by NCOs, companies reduced to fractions, detachments still in combat without communication, like islands that command could only assume were alive by the sound of fire or the absence of a final report. For many officers, this tally was not just a bureaucratic obligation. It was the real measure of how much remained to attempt to hold the front the next day. At the same time, the internal problem continued, the rear area disturbed by airborne actions and infiltrations. Although the intensity varied by zone, the effect persisted. Insecure routes, monitored crossings, delayed communications. German officers needed roads to move reserves to the coast. The enemy had designed their operation precisely to prevent those roads from being a clear channel. The night allowed some points to be cleared, but it did not eliminate the underlying insecurity. The result was that many decisions were made with a conservative criterion: move only the indispensable, consolidate what could be, avoid committing large columns on doubtful routes. By midnight, the German command faced an operational dilemma that was no longer abstract. Should they counterattack seriously or consolidate interior lines of containment? A broad counterattack required concentration, coordination, and speed. Concentration was difficult due to dispersion. Coordination was fragile due to degraded communications. Speed was still conditioned by routes and the threat of being detected at dawn. Still, the logic of expelling the enemy before they could solidify remained valid in theory. The problem was that the clock had advanced too much during the day. As June 7th began, the war accelerated again. The early hours, between 3 o'clock and dawn, were used for limited movements, position adjustments, and preparing new defenses. German officers tried to establish more coherent lines, even if they were farther inland than the original ones. In some sectors, it was ordered to occupy containment positions on elevations, crossroads, and the edges of towns that could function as anchors. In others, remnants of units were reorganized into improvised groupings with a clear objective: to halt the enemy's advance inland and protect routes that could still sustain the movement of reserves. As dawn broke, the enemy's air superiority reasserted itself as an overwhelming force. What could move cautiously at night became exposed during the day. German officers realized that June 7th would not be a repeat of June 6th, but a different phase. The enemy was no longer trying to land, they were trying to expand from the land. This shifted the threat pattern. It was no longer just about breaking landing craft on the beach or silencing waves of landings. It was about containing patrols, halting columns, disputing crossings and towns, preventing the perimeter from expanding to the point where even the coastal defenses still standing would be rendered useless. During the morning of June 7th, German reports began to describe with more stability what had been chaos the previous day. A more consistent language emerged: bridgehead, perimeter, penetrations, support points. This stabilization did not mean improvement, but understanding. Command began to accept that the enemy now had a front in formation, and that this front would not disappear due to lack of fuel or spontaneous attrition. For the German officers, accepting this meant adjusting their immediate objective. It was no longer about expelling the enemy, but containing them and buying time for a larger response, which, however, was being suffocated by enemy air control and the partial disruption of routes. The counterattacks on June 7th, where they were attempted, tended to be limited and costly, not due to lack of will, but structure. To strike effectively, concentration was needed. Concentrating meant being detected meant being punished before reaching the point of impact. In several areas, German infantry managed to halt specific advances, hold towns for hours, recover a crossing, or contain a road. But each local success encountered the same general trend. The enemy, with growing material and logistical superiority, could replace losses, introduce new means, and maintain pressure. The coastal bunkers that continued to resist began to take on a different role, not as walls, but as residual obstacles. Some continued firing at routes or beach areas, but their strategic impact was diminished if the enemy had already taken control of rear access points. Operationally, the front was moving inland. For German officers, this transition was one of the hardest realities to register, because it turned weeks of coastal preparation into a maneuver battle on terrain that favored infiltration and close combat. Throughout June 7th, the German command also had to manage responsibilities. Reports upwards had to explain why certain positions had fallen, why certain reserves hadn't arrived in time, why the system had reacted slowly. These explanations were rarely confessions. They were displays of conditions: bombing, loss of communications, airborne attacks on routes, air superiority, unit dispersion, lack of mobility. But behind this language, the fact was clear: the defensive design had been overcome at its most vulnerable point. which was not the thickness of the concrete but the reaction time. The afternoon of June 7th consolidated the strategic reality. German officers could still fight effectively in specific sectors, but the invasion was no longer an event to deny, it was a front to manage. With every passing hour, the enemy strengthened their infrastructure on land, expanded their secure zone and reduced the possibility of being pushed back into the sea. The window for a quick solution was narrowing to almost nothing. In the final reports of the day, the tone was no longer one of alarm, but of a settled situation. Positions were being registered, available resources listed, new containment lines defined. The language of June 7th compared to June 6th showed the most important shift, the operational acceptance that the enemy had achieved the essential objective, which was to hold and grow in France. The Allies were advancing inland,